Hi students, this week we are discussing Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. Albert Camus is a French-Algerian philosopher and fiction writer. He was born in 1913 and died tragically in 1960 in a car accident. There was a train ticket found in his pocket for the location where he was going. So he made a last-minute decision to take car instead, and that led to his death. And he famously said that he thought dying in a car crash was the most meaningless way to die. So his death has a sort of existential story to it. He was also a political activist. You can read a lot about his political philosophy and his commitments to different political parties and his critique of communism. And he also is most famous for his writings on the absurd. So the myth of Sisyphus is his longest discussion of the absurd. And he starts out by saying there is but one truly philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. So he starts out by saying the most important question that a philosopher can answer is whether we should bother living at all. It's pretty dark, but he is writing this in 1942. So the world is not in a great place, right? We have World War II, we have all sorts of political tensions, and we really have a world that feels like it is falling apart everywhere. So Camus is saying that this is the question that philosophers have to answer. He says, all the other questions philosophers answer, whether the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, sort of abstract ideas like that, those actually come afterwards. Those are not the most primary or most important questions. The most important questions have to deal with the very nature of our existence, putting one foot in front of the other and continuing to live. That's what we need philosophy for. And he says that this is not the type of question you answer through the use of reason. This is not a conceptual question that you answer rationally. He says that these are facts the heart can feel, yet they call for careful study before they become clear to the intellect. So it's almost like there's a sort of intuition, there's a sort of feeling we have about this philosophical question that's so fundamental, but it's almost like our minds aren't ready for it. So we have to kind of feel our way through it and prepare it to be thought about. So there's a lot of reflection that goes into answering this question. Is life worth living? This is really interesting because this is the type of philosophical question that you really have to pose and answer yourself. Someone else might be able to give you reasons for living, but it's going to be meaningless to you unless you really feel it and it comes from your own mind and heart. There's not really an objective answer to this. It's not like you're going to find the sort of set of answers that fulfill the question in a particular way, and it's indisputable and it has the most evidence. It's not about gathering evidence or providing a sort of formula to answer this question. And it's not like you could get outside of it, right? There's a way that this has to do with how we live. And so it's going to be fundamentally a question you answer subjectively. It's not really even an intellectual question. It's not sort of like you're solving something mentally. It's more of an existential one. And here, feeling is more helpful than reason. And Camus keeps emphasizing that throughout this book, is that we need to pay attention to the feeling that we have. Camus says that often we connect this question of whether life is worth living or not to the question of whether or not life has meaning. If life is meaningless, then it seems like no, we should die. And Camus, a huge thing he's doing in The Myth of Sisyphus is show that that is not the right answer. Life can be completely meaningless and still worth living. Suicide is not a solution to the absurdity of life. And in fact, he thinks that we should embrace absurdity. We should embrace the meaninglessness of existence, and we can live a far happier, fuller, more interesting, more intensive life when we do that. So what is the absurd for Camus? He's getting this idea from Sartre, and Sartre's concept of the absurd is just meaninglessness. And he also talks about the absurd in Kierkegaard and Heidegger and other thinkers. The absurd is something that gets discussed a lot in philosophy because philosophy is really interested in things that we might not have the best answer for. Philosophy loves questions and questioning things and kind of throwing out our common sense notions. So the absurd is that whatever defies meaning and rationality. He describes it as when the set collapses, right? This idea of everything's together, everything's in a particular order, we have a certain set of expectations about something, and then it all falls apart. So this is how he's thinking of the absurd, is when we experience our world falling apart. He says that in those moments, strangeness creeps in, and when the world becomes dense, foreign, and hostile to us, instead of it being this setting in which we feel fully comfortable and fully immersed, we feel uncomfortable. It's this sort of harrowing experience. It can be sickening. We can feel nausea when we experience the familiar becoming suddenly unfamiliar, and the things we think we know suddenly are not knowable. He says it's a incalculable feeling, right? There's something where this normal calculations we would make, the normal way we have of understanding the world, just completely falls apart on us. So in those instances, we feel like an alien or stranger, like we're exiled from what is familiar to us. The main point he keeps emphasizing when he talks about the absurd is that the absurd is not like an object. It's not like the world is absurd or something in the world is absurd. And it's not like we are absurd. It's not humans who are absurd. It's the relationship between a human and the world that causes this absurdity. So what is the origin of absurdity is the fact that humans like to know things and try our very best to understand things. And the world refuses to be understood. It refuses to submit to our logic. So Camus says the mind's deepest desire, even in its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feeling in the face of his universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity, an appetite for clarity. So for humans, we have this really strong insistence on the familiar, right? We like our routines. We like to feel like we can grasp things and understand where they are. You know, I always put my car keys in the same exact spot so I never lose them, and I feel familiar with where they are. And when my car keys are lost, it's a terrible feeling. I don't know what I'm going to do, right? That's pretty banal as an example, but we can think of more important things, right? A lot of our friendships and relationships rely on familiarity. It's a lot harder to say certain things or do certain things with a complete stranger than it is what a person who's familiar to us. So we love familiarity and we love clarity. I'm sure there's been times when you've been reading philosophy in this class where you get super frustrated when something is hard to understand. You would prefer it to be crystal clear and easy to kind of just process. But a lot of existentialists are grappling with really big, complex ideas, and they are not very clear. So this is something that humans desire, familiarity and clarity. And this is something that the world denies us. So he says, understanding the world for a man is reducing it to the human, stamping it with his seal. So if I'm seeking to understand something in human terms, human concepts, human ideas and arguments, I take something out there in the world and I put my stamp on it. I put it within a structure that makes sense to me. My concepts form a little framework for taking that thing and making it mine. So there's this way that thinking about something and understanding it and grasping it is almost like claiming ownership over it, right? So there's this idea that we get to be masters of the world through science, right? Because science helps us to understand the universe and make it ours. And Camus is saying, well, that's what we try to do, but more often the universe refuses to be understood, and it's full of mystery and it's full of things that cannot be understood. And so when we understand how little we actually understand about the world, when we kind of are confronted with the vastness of all there is to know, of the universe's mystery, that's sort of when we encounter the absurd. And we can have that in these sort of individual moments where we thought we knew something and we realized we do not, or we thought we had control over a situation and then we realize we absolutely do not have control over a situation, right? There's moments where we feel particularly lost and confused, and that's really where we experience the absurd. So the theater of the absurd, I put a a short video, a crash course on the theater of the absurd if you're interested in it. But this idea of absurdity gets explored in a lot of different plays in the 1950s and 60s. This is Waiting for Godot, which is one of the most famous theater of the absurd plays by Samuel Beckett. He wrote it, and it was performed for the first time in the early 1950s. And the theater of the absurd was very much inspired by Camus' reflections on absurdity, as well as sort of processing through all these feelings people had after World War II and the sort of devastation and genocide and the invention of the atomic bomb and all these things that happened in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, kind of made people lose faith that there was progress in humanity, that there were particular purposes that human life is guided by, that we're going to achieve, that there is a God who gives us a sense of purpose, right? There's a lot of nihilism and sort of lack of meaning in the world after World War II. And so the theater of the absurd is responding to this. In the play Waiting for Godot, it's meant to be kind of an abstract, symbolic sort of plot about what it is to be human. And there's two bums kind of passing time in this semi-bored way with all these shenanigans while they wait for Godot, who is God, and God never appears. He never comes. So Waiting for Godot is supposed to be this idea of waiting for God to arrive, waiting for the solution, waiting for something that will never come. And that it's funny. The thing is, these are very dark plays, but they're also really funny, ridiculous plays. So that's what absurdity is. It's when you're looking at the way that the world is kind of hostile and indifferent to us, and you're like, it's kind of funny. You know, it's there's something a little silly about the absurd. Humor is kind of like it's kind of like an itch, right? An itch is a pain, but it's not a pain that hurts. It's a pain that kind of tickles or creates a different type of sensation. So this is kind of a type of humor, a nihilistic type of humor that's just confronting how difficult life is and the fact that there's not a meaning that's handed to us on a golden platter, and we really have to figure out what to do with our lives. There's also some more just blatantly ridiculous theater of the absurd plays. This is The Chairs by Eugene Ionesco. And it's just about chairs. It's about two old people rearranging chairs for guests who, again, never come. So there are these interesting plays. And if you're interested in the history of theater, they're really worth studying. So Camus says, what do we do with the absurd? Well, he says the only coherent philosophical position is revolt. He says all these other philosophers, they try to find a solution. They try to rationalize the absurd. They try to posit some sort of solution to the absurd. He's like, no, we just have to embrace it. We're not going to ever resolve the absurd. We want to understand, and we can't get rid of that desire, and the world cannot be understood, and we cannot change that. So we have to preserve this conflict between our desire to understand and the universe's mystery. And this is our way of challenging the world. You know, we're refusing to be complacent. We're not letting go of the conflict. We're not letting go of the challenge. We're rising against it. And he describes that as living without appeal or hope. I think of this as a kind of like rebel without a cause. It's not like you have some sort of banner you're waving around. It's not like you're fighting for something specific. You're just refusing to give up. You're refusing to let in, and you're just going to live and live as much as you can, as hard as you can, despite the fact life doesn't have any inherent purpose to it. And he says it's that revolt that gives life its value. It's that resistance, that revolt, that force that we can exert that gives our life a sense of purpose. It's not some sort of meaning that someone else can give us or some meaning that we get from the universe. We get our meaning from living. So he uses the myth of Sisyphus, right? That's the title, the myth of Sisyphus, to kind of exemplify what he means. So the myth of Sisyphus, Sisyphus is a character in ancient Greek myth. He was supposed to be a wise mortal, and he was punished. There's different stories, as there always are with myths. In some of the myths, he doesn't really take the gods seriously, or he insults them. In other myths, he dies, but he doesn't go to the underworld. He just kind of hangs out in the world, refusing to go to the underworld, and he gets punished for that. So his punishment is he has to push a rock, a very heavy boulder, all the way up a mountain. And when it gets to the top, it never stays. It always rolls down. And then he has to go down, get the rock again, and roll it back up. And he has to do this over and over for eternity. And Camus says that the ancient Greeks, or the ancient Greek gods, thought for some reason that there was no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor, right? So the fact that this is a punishment, doing the same thing over and over and not getting any final result out of it, that's sort of a metaphor for someone who thinks life has to have a final purpose, right? And it's a punishment to live if you don't have that final achievement or final punishment. And it's a really interesting metaphor because we experience this in life. I remember once I was 10 years old and I grew up in a family where my chore was to wash the dishes and dry them and put them away. We took turns doing it. And I just remember at 10, I had this realization. I'm like, I'm washing these dishes, but they're going to get dirty again. And then I have to wash them again. And then they get dirty again. And it really bothered me, this concept that I was doing something that wouldn't last, that I'd have to do it over and over and over again. And I think back to my 10-year-old self, and I'm like, girl, that's going to be a lot of things in your life, a lot of things you have to do over and over and over again, and even really big achievements. I remember I worked to get my PhD for 7 years, which is how long it takes to get an MA PhD. And when I achieved it, I still didn't feel like that rock was on top of the mountain. It was kind of like, well, what next? What's the next thing I do? So a lot of times, even when we achieve something in life, we still have to keep living. We still have to keep going. And so this is kind of what life is. It's repetition, and it's doing the same banal tasks over. This is what it means to live in many ways. And Camus kind of pointing this out. He wants to say that Sisyphus is a hero, an absurd hero. He tells us that we can imagine Sisyphus happy, and he says we must imagine Sisyphus happy. So even though he's pushing this huge boulder up a mountain and it's not really going to give any final result, it's just going to roll down again, and he has to do the same thing infinitely for all of eternity, that's no reason why we should consider him to be someone who's tragic. He says that we can imagine him experiencing joy at the force he exerts and the sort of mindset he has as he walks down the mountain back towards his boulder again. So Camus is trying to imagine what it is like to be Sisyphus and to take this infinite punishment, infinite task, and make something meaningful out of it for himself, even though it ultimately doesn't have a meaning. For Camus, he says that the absurd is that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent. So the absurd denies meaning. It denies a sort of settled meaning or universal meaning. But he says that it makes something eloquent. It makes nothingness eloquent. So we can find something very poignant in Sisyphus and in the sort of infinite task that living is. He says that the absurd can awaken our consciousness, right? When we're struck by the absurdity of something, the things that we take for granted suddenly become strange, and that means we get to see them with new eyes. So the absurd can lead to new realizations. Even if we don't understand or grasp something fully, we at least get to see it with new eyes, which can be a very profound experience. And that's why he wants to tell us that even if life is meaningless, that doesn't mean we should embrace suicide. The meaninglessness of life can itself be a reason to live. It's not a rational reason, but it can give us something. So he says it was previously a question of finding out whether or not life had to have meaning to be lived. It now becomes clear, on the contrary, that it will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Living is keeping the absurd alive. So Camus is inviting us to keep the absurd alive and to take pleasure in living in absurdity. I hope you enjoy reading Camus this week. If you have any questions, please email me. And I'm available if you ever want to Zoom. Thank you so much.